The Journey of Sir Alberich Lichten. Day 4, Part 2. I regret to write that the remaining journey here was anything but remarkable. I will attempt to keep things trimmed down to a reasonable degree, but I fear my pen may begin to wander as I relive what we all have seen on our travels. Not long after we set off from our short rest, we were separated. A heavy mist rolled in, and everyone began tugging and pulling at their apparel now that it had begun to stick to their skin in every uncomfortable way possible. While Ordon was complaining and not paying attention, he tripped over a root sticking out of the ground and fell down a small hillside, disappearing into the mist. We called out for him, and he called back with not a small amount of swear words, mostly related to him hurting his ankle once more. Though nobody could see very well, I'm sure everyone saw one another roll their eyes with frustration. I offered to go down the hillside with Adelaine to check on Ordon. My reasoning was Adelaine would be deft enough to climb down unhindered by the angle, and I needed someone to watch my back as I patched up Ordon for the third time in a single day. But Ulrika and Pietro were on the correct path, so I suggested them to stay put so that we wouldn't get entirely lost. It was absolutely a move entirely based on strategy and not at all based on getting Ulrika and Pietro alone together for a while. And anyone who claims otherwise is simply not as brilliant of a strategist as I. Once we got to the bottom of the hill, Adelaine and I saw Ordon sitting against a tree holding his ankle. He shouted out, "Well, well, it's about time you guys showed up. Do you know how scary this place is when you're alone? I'll tell you, it's horrifying. Every sound feels like death is whispering in your ear. The heat feels like I'm being cooked in my own skin. And don't even get me started on the And without a single hint of warning, a blue vine-like tentacle wrapped around his torso and yanked him up to the top of the tree. Adelaine and I grabbed our weapons and prepared to call out to the others for assistance, but before we could, 2 more vines wrapped around us and hoisted us up as well. The vines squeezed tightly around my midsection, and the force of being ripped from the ground made me think for half a second I would be torn in half. Luckily, the journey up was only about 2 seconds, and I was swiftly thrown into a sort of nest made of tightly woven branches and a thick layer of leaves. I looked around for Ordon and Adelaine, but my vision was blurry and my head was spinning. They were gone. Whether they went to another nest or I was hallucinating from the heat, I am unsure. All I could think was to take the usual steps when I felt there might be some mind-affecting trickery afoot. I thought of my wife and my children to ground myself, to ensure myself that I was real and I was able to think. If I could manage that, I began to focus on my physical body relative to the space I was in. I looked down and saw my feet. Good. Glad those are still there. I moved my sword in front of my face. Weapons present, arms working, vital. I lifted my foot slightly and placed it on a raised bit of branch. I could feel the change in texture and elevation. This was real. Perhaps the vine had flung me to a much higher elevation than I thought, and the air was much thinner here. Thus was the cause of my mental muddiness. I wasn't certain, though, nor am I certain now. Regardless, the specifics didn't matter. All that mattered was finding everyone and regrouping. With my weapons in front of me, I took silent steps towards the edge of the nest, making sure not to step on any loose twigs. I made it to the edge, and I peered off the side. I could see nothing but mist. No ground, no other nests, not even any other branches. I stood there and weighed some options, but before I could come to any sort of conclusive step forward, I heard the faintest sound of wind blowing from behind me. I waited until the sound was nearly on top of me before spinning around and slashing wildly with both my sword and the edge of my shield. I was showered with warm, bluish-brown blood as I had just slashed across the neck and chest of a featherless, pale blue flying beast. It had a body similar to a hummingbird, though it was almost as large as I was. Its face was almost entirely taken up by a circular mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth. Its massive, leathery wings beat silently, but incredibly quickly. Just as soon as I was able to see what I was about to slaughter, it dashed away as quick as a flash and was able to dodge my next swing. My first thought was to my companions. My ears were trained to detect the subtlest of sounds, but the other two captives surely were not. I was certain they must have fallen victim to this beast's sneak attack. I knew I needed to end this quickly, so I charged forward and swung wildly. And as I had planned, the flying beast darted away about 15 feet behind me and started to speed towards my back. I turned around last minute, swung again, and again it skirted to my side. It began another charge, this time even faster, and determined to sink its teeth into me. The creature flew towards me with a speed that wouldn't allow it a quick change of course. And within a single breath, I invoked my sword's magical properties and teleported 5 feet behind where I stood. The creature flew towards where I once stood, though with me no longer there, it caught nothing. But with me now behind it, within the same breath, I stabbed my long sword into its back and flooded my weapon with radiant energy, a trick I had learned from Sir William Joshua Alberich. The energy flowed through my arm, through my sword, and exploded inside the back of the creature. The whole backside of the devil bird exploded, and the momentum of its flight, mixed with the extra propelling force from my blast, sent it flying off the edge of the nest into the mist. I took a deep breath and opened my ears to see if I could hear any more. What I heard instead was the sound of Ordon yelling. Again. It was coming from below me. Now, I'm not a simple man. I don't always resort to the fastest and most idiotic solutions. But in this instance, the only thing I could think to do to help was to cut my way through the bottom of the nest and jump down. As unsophisticated as it was, it worked well enough. I made a small hole and looked through it, and I could barely make out a nest similar to the one I was in, though significantly smaller, hence why I was unable to see it earlier when I looked off the side. The drop looked to be about 50 feet. Nothing fun, but certainly doable if I could get Ordon's attention and he had finally mastered his featherfall spell. I leapt down, called out to him, and after a quiet, "What the fuck?" from him, he flicked his wrist towards me, and I began to feel the safety of falling slowly. No sooner had he done this, did a group of 3 of those flying beasts show up and descend upon him. He instinctively fired another volley of 5 flaming beams, and followed it up with an additional firebolt. Nearly everything collided with the beast, and it was engulfed in flame and died almost instantaneously. I landed and sprinted towards him, but I unfortunately couldn't quite get to him in time. The creatures flew at him, mouths open and teeth spinning, clamping down on him in various places and beginning to carry him into the air. Ordon screamed in pain and cried out for help. I was able to catch up before they made it too far off the ground and grabbed onto the tail of one of the beasts, and I managed to keep them from flying off with Ordon. Unfortunately, it then turned its attention to me, and it lunged at me. It dug its teeth into the shoulder of the arm that carried my sword, rendering it immobile. It felt like it was sawing through my skin and bones, but the only thing that I cared about was getting the other one to drop Ordon. It was unable to get him fully off the ground by itself, but it still had its teeth sunk deep into his bicep. I knew that there was nothing I could do with one of the beasts still on me, so I took my shield and I clumsily began to try and hack at the one eating my shoulder. After a few swings, I felt its grip loosen, and I was able to rip free of its mouth. Most of the flesh on my shoulder had been torn off by this point, and I could feel the humidity reaching my collarbone. and I was losing blood at an incredibly alarming rate. But Ordon was slowly being dragged towards the edge of the nest, and that is all that mattered in that moment. So I dropped my shield, took my long sword in both hands, and with every ounce of strength I had left, I drove the tip of the blade into the creature's stomach, and again flowed forth a surge of radiant energy. This time was much less spectacular, and much more filled with desperation. The blow I took from Red Eyes was much more than I would like to admit, and the physical exertion of the day had really begun to wear on me. I managed to cut the rest of the way through the beast's stomach, and it gurgled its final death rattles. I pushed nearly all of my remaining willpower into hastening myself and dashing towards the final creature. Ordon's screams had started to fade into a quiet pleading for a savior, and the beast was nearing the edge of the nest and was surely going to drop him to his death. It was not an elegant race, just an injured old man forcing himself towards an over-encumbered flying monster. And it was a race I did not win. I tried as best I could, but the blood loss and the head spinning was too much, and I faltered for just a moment. Long enough for the creature to throw Ordon off the edge and turn its attention towards me. Ordon hadn't enough energy to scream, and was tossed unceremoniously off the side to his doom. My mind was unable to focus. I could feel nothing in my dominant arm, and was forced to wield my sword in my left. I couldn't tell if I was standing or not. I couldn't tell where the beast was. I felt the soft touch of death reaching for my throat, and I prepared for the end by saying a prayer to the Emperor. I could hardly lift my sword to attack. The beast flew at me with newfound vigor, likely spurred on by the ease with which it thought it could put an end to me. I hadn't the wherewithal to dodge, so I simply took the hit. It flew up high and came down from above, going for my other arm, aiming to immobilize me entirely as it had seen the relative speed I had dealt with its companion. The teeth extended and began grinding even before reaching me, ready for an actual meal. The creature was intelligent enough to know that I was still armed and chose to attack at an angle that was the least easy to defend. I heard it howl in victory, as its jaws were just about to clamp down on my one remaining shoulder. It howled, for it thought it had won. It was incorrect, of course, for there is a difference between lifting your sword to swing and raising it enough so the tip is just above your shoulder. Upon seeing the beast take flight, I pointed the tip of my sword skyward, just as the monstrosity flew into me, and it did all the work for me, rending its own insides from mouth to stomach. For good measure, I threw a bit of radiant energy into it just to be sure. Its mass hung on the end of my weapon, and I collapsed under its weight. Out of breath, out of blood, down one companion, and the other 3 lost in mist. I picked up my shield, sat, and pulled out one of the healing potions I had prepared. I bit down on a strap of leather and poured it out over the wound in my shoulder. It was a very, very familiar sting, and one that was always unwelcome. I muttered a prayer for Ordon. Not knowing anything about his religion, I simply wished him a safe passage into a good afterlife. Then I sat there in silence for a minute. Maybe 20 minutes. I'm unsure, honestly. I just know that I sat until I heard a voice. Adelaine was calling out to the ether. Newly invigorated at hearing another voice, I called out as well. She called from below me, saying,
"Hey, I think I killed the last of those flying shits."
Is there any way for you to get down here? I responded, saying that the only way I knew how was with another feather fall, but that Ordon was gone. Then another voice rang out. Ordon's voice. I can cast it again, old man. I'm more than capable of casting a bunch more spells. I sat in stunned silence. Again, I have no idea how long. I couldn't believe that bastard was not only alive, but sensible enough to be unappreciative and shitty. Of course, I should have expected no less. It was Ordon, after all. I cut a hole through the floor of that nest as well, and I jumped down, being saved by Ordon's spell once again. Then we regrouped. Apparently Ordon had fallen nearly unconscious when he was tossed down, but was able to catch himself on the edge of the nest below his original. Adeline was beset by two of those creatures, but she made quick work of them, having used some of her magical capabilities to melt their minds. Apparently they had been so simple-minded that it didn't take much in the way of effort on her part, and she remained untouched. She had then spent the rest of her time attempting to see how far down the ground was by throwing branches and guiding pebbles off the side of her nest. And then, well, Ordon fell down. She estimated we were about 60 feet in the air, judging by the sounds. Ordon said he could use another featherfall spell, but it would be the last he could use unless they rested a while longer. But there was no time for that, as Pietro and Helrica were still alone. So, we were able to waste no time. The three of us jumped off into the misty expanse, we landed safely, and quickly made our way back to where Pietro and Helrica were supposed to be standing. And of course, they were gone. I did my best to reassure the others that our newly lost compatriots had simply wandered off to look at some new flowers. I personally didn't believe this, but I think that was just the pessimism of having almost been killed showing. We decided we would not split up again, and we would simply make a few rounds around where we were supposed to be, gently calling for them. Luckily, my fake theory turned out to be true, and we found them not far off with their heads inside a couple of bushes. When we called their names, their heads shot out of the bushes and their eyes lit up like they were dogs who had just seen their owner for the first time in a year. They ran at us and grabbed us all, much to our dismay. Pietro and Helrica started going on and on about how we had been gone for over an hour now and that it would be getting dark soon. Apparently they had scaled down the hillside and found no trace of us, but they were hesitant to leave the spot altogether. But this made little sense, as we had spent no more than 30 minutes tops in those nests. This was deeply concerning, because it meant that one of us was wrong, and either option was bad. But we erred on the side of caution, and began a swift march through the jungle to the location we needed to be at before the rapidly approaching nightfall hit. As we walked, we idly chatted about what we all had experienced. Pietro and Helrica took special notice of my injured shoulder, but I didn't give them many details. If there was one thing I learned from commanding armies, it was that a leader must always save face in front of his people, even if it meant lying to them. Even if it meant marching forward without the use of my right arm. Around an hour after it got dark, we found where we were meant to set up camp for the night. Before settling down, I used the last of my healing abilities to fix my shoulder up, now confident that I wouldn't need it, as Ordon would create an impermeable barrier that would protect us for the night. As much as I tried to relax and wash away the day's stresses with flavored meat and tea, all that occupied my mind was the mental well-being of my teammates. They all seem outwardly in fine spirits. Even Adeline was more talkative than I had ever seen her. I write this now as I watch Ordon write notes on how he can cast spells even quicker and quicken his reaction times. Helrica is drawing diagrams on the different flowers she's picked, and Pietro is off in a corner concocting more poisons. Adeline herself is humming quietly whilst making herself a second dinner. I will pull Helrica to the side and speak to her as I had planned to do so earlier. I believe that's enough writing for today. I shall begin a new chapter tomorrow with news of my conversations with Helrica.